All right. So, all right. So you are listening to Morbid Movies with Dom and Mary, and today we are going to be discussing the Guillermo del Toro 2015 film Crimson Peak. So here we are. How you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. That was a much more succinct intro than last time. It was great. Really well done, Mary. Really well done.
Continuously improving. That's what we're going for here.
Absolutely. Growth and development. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I guess the first question I have as we lead into this podcast is what makes Crimson Peak a goth movie? You noted in your notes that it has kind of gained a cult following as years have gone on. But for you, when we came up with this podcast, why did you want to bring it to Morbid Movies? What makes it a goth film?
Well, I mean, I is a personal favorite for me as well. But I mean, the thing is, Crimson Peak, and I will not be the first person to have said this, it's really Guillermo del Toro writing a love letter to gothic romance and gothic horror movies, and it draws so much from those genres, especially from old like Hammer horror films, the ones that had Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee and things like that. It's really catnip for goths, I would say, because it's kind of just jam-packed densely with all of those like aesthetics and tropes that really are a huge part of the entire genre.
Mm.
Like in the more Victorian goth sense and the cyberpunk sense, like our last film was, obviously. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the really interesting things about Crimson Peak is it sort of subverts, you talk about tropes there. It really subverts what is come to be expected of certain films, romantic films. The damsel in distress, as you noted, isn't present here. The female characters, for better and worse, in this case, are the stronger characters, the much more pronounced characters, I think, particularly in the case of Edith's character, Mia. I have to get the pronunciation right. So Mia, I will just say Mia.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
you
it's
know,
a Vasikowska,
yeah.
which
So
I had to
yeah,
write down.
yeah. Mia Wasikowska. That character is really, really strong. Very, very, central. Her ability to survive what she does in this film, against Lucille as a character is amazing. And really, Tom Hiddleston, who is of course always the hero, always the championed, the good-looking British sort of cliche, really takes a back seat here, Mary. And I think that was probably the most interesting thing for me when I watched this last week was really reveling in Edith's character and Edith's strength, which I thought was really great.
Yeah, absolutely. I would even go a step further and argue that, even beyond there not being a damsel in distress, the damsel in this movie, though he isn't super heavily featured, is Dr. Alan McMichael because he's the one who ultimately, by the end of the film, needs saving. But it is definitely interesting that this film, the real drivers of all of the action in the film, for good or bad, are the women in the film.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
the men are mostly useless if you want to get down to it.
No, no, I absolutely, I agree, I agree, and I think that again, but there's a lot of depth to these characters, and that kind of morbid, there's a much wider sort of conversation around this, which we can bring in and encourage people to engage in. I think the most interesting character in this is the darkest character, the most troubled, Lucille for me personally, obviously a lot of darkness, a lot of as you say, manipulative behavior, as you sort of alluded to in your notes, a lot of hidden depths to Lucille's character. And I believe that was even a choice from the performer to choose to play this character because of that. I don't know what you thought about that, Mary, whether you agree that Lucille is probably the most interesting quote unquote character in this film.
I think I would agree with that. And that character death is or depth is definitely a hallmark of Guillermo del Toro films. I don't know how familiar you are with his working process, but he tends to write like full biographies of every character, even if most of the information is never conveyed. He knows like their horoscope signs, their favorite color, everything. So I imagine that for the actors involved, that gives them a lot to work with right up front. And there's some really just wonderful performances, but Lucille especially, since she is such a huge driver of all of the events in this film, most of what happens is really comes out of her plots for how to continue to survive and try to preserve the world that she's built for herself with Thomas.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah, you make some very good observations in your notes. You know, these again very, very manipulative, as we said. But there's a lot of deeper elements to it. You know, where clearly there's some abuse. Obviously, we can't go too in depth to the nature of it on YouTube, but obviously there's the brotherly sisterly relationship and the sort of there's I don't want to say darker, but certainly the way the relationship has grown is a result of what you would interpret as abusive behavior. And I wonder, and there's a wider conversation which we can perhaps lead to the end. If there is ever a time where the audience might sympathize with, obviously, they sympathize with um, Lucille, but to a bigger extent, Thomas. I think Thomas has the empathy, perhaps.
yeah, Thomas has that point in the film where you see that turn and you realize, this is someone who, had things gone a little differently for him, might have been able to make it, but he's really being held back by Lucille, who is absolutely so trapped in their dysfunctional past that I think that's the real tragedy of Lucille is she's someone for whom there's no hope. She can't come back from where she is because she really they imply it somewhat in the backstory. You get more of it if you read the book version of the film, but she took so much of the brunt of the abuse that they face that I just don't believe that there's any point, from when it begins when she probably could have been clawed back
Mm,
to a more
mm,
normal life.
yeah,
So there
yeah.
is a definitely a certain tragedy and a certain sympathy when you consider like that she really just had no other direction to go.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in terms of the conversation around the most in-depth character and the most interesting character, obviously you must also consider, I think, in that, Mia's character, Edith. Do you think that this film has gained such a cult following in the years after because of the strength of Edith and how Edith is presented as again, almost the hero here in this film? Is that the reason why it's become so popular in not necessarily just the goth scene, but also wider popular culture? Because, even though we're in 2024, Mary, strong female leads, you could argue, are still not as predominant as perhaps they could be in Hollywood and sort of wider film culture.
Right. I definitely think that that plays a role. And this film also, to be fair, suffered from mishandling of its marketing because the initial trailers definitely presented it as more of a standard haunted house horror film, which it absolutely is not. So I think that that played a role because initial audiences did not get the movie they were expecting. And I think that word of mouth definitely makes a difference. But the cult following it's built, I think, is not only because of the just extreme effort that went into the aesthetics of the film. They did quite a bit of work to build the set pieces and the costumes, but also definitely because you don't get that kind of female driven narrative very often. And as we've seen with other films that have performed really well, if you do make a film where the women in the film get to take the lead and have agency, those films do tend to perform well, provided that the writing is good. I mean, we saw that most recently. It's obviously a different genre, but the Barbie movie
Hmm.
was huge.
Hmm.
We saw that with, it's going back even further, like the Alien franchise with Sigourney Weaver was huge. When you can get a good film with a tough female lead, people really do enjoy that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's one of the reasons why. And now I understand as well, talking to you about it, why, again, that sort of wider cultural impact is there. I also think, you mentioned the set pieces and the visual. There's an interesting fact which I'll get you to talk about in a minute about about the sort of the set and the way it was built and also taken down. However, I do want to remark about some of the sort of aesthetic points in this film. Very goth, but also just beautifully done. Like when I read your fact on this, I was surprised because it's such a beautiful house that they built. Such a goth house, such a the sort of haunted house aesthetic is never more prevalent. If you want to see a great haunted house, watch this film. If you want to see a great goth house, watch this film. One of my favorite parts of the aesthetic of the film. And also, I noticed, and I think this is down to the clay and obviously the Crimson Peak. I noticed a red hue on some of the shots as well. And I wondered if that was just me, but obviously it was very present, that red color and the red coloring all over the house alongside sort of green and darks. But I did notice a red hue, and red seemed to be very prominent, thematically, of course, with the clay, but also on the screen as kind of a almost like a stylistic effect. I don't know if you noticed that as well.
Oh, most definitely. And this is another thing, just beyond even the attention to detail in the set building, color plays a massive role in this film. Is you only see the color red around, Crimson Peak, Allendale Hall, or ghosts that are connected to that hall and died a violent death. Even beyond that, color plays a greater role, as you'll notice the colors of the ghosts. Edith's mother, when she appears to warn her, has a more black coloration, which, is related to how her illness is progressed before she died. And all of the ghosts that died violent deaths at the hall are red, with the exception of, and this is a spoiler, unfortunately, the final time you see Thomas has that white coloration because he's ready to move on. So even the way that the ghosts are color coded very symbolically plays in. There's quite a bit of symbolism
Mm,
just packed into this film. It's so dense that, even, after I've watched this film so many times, there's still new details that I notice when I watch it again, because it's just, like Guillermo del Toro films always are, just so packed in with
absolutely.
details
Yeah.
that you just can't
Yeah.
take it all in.
And I think that's what I think this podcast is so useful for, because I'm learning stuff through doing this with you. And also just the details, the little details mattering, the little Easter eggs, I think is a really great thing to talk about in films like this. You mentioned actually in your notes that Allerdale Hall can be interpreted as a character as well in its own right. I thought it was a very interesting interpretation. And I can kind of understand it going back to it. Obviously, again, you mentioned that there's been quite a few ghosts that have gone through that hall, Mary.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It is the hall itself really does feel like another character, because it's, especially throughout the film, the hall makes sounds, and because it's they frequently reference it slowly sinking into the ground, so you hear it like almost breathing and heaving throughout the film, and the location is such a, it's the title of the film even, it's so heavily involved in the story, you can't divorce it from that. And especially, with the seeping red clay and the just visual presence, it's that atmosphere is just so key to the piece. And this is very much part of that influence of like the old Hammer films, where those haunted mansion locations were just like such a huge part of the aesthetic of the film.
Yeah, again, I think aesthetic is a really good, focus point for this. If you do listen to this podcast and you're really big into, film aesthetics, I would just on that level, watch this film. An interesting sort of point on the aesthetic is Doug Jones is in this, and Doug Jones is a favorite of many, many horror fans, of goth fans, of course, known for Hellboy, known for pretty much every creepy, Pan's Labyrinth, I believe.
Okay,
So he's in
and
everything.
he's Doug Jones is one. He's in everything, I'm pretty sure, because he's just so easy to shove into a latex costume. I think that is absolutely a skill. I think in the same way that if you're doing motion capture, you go find Andy Serkis. There's just some actors who are the guy who does that job. He's the rubber suit guy for
Yeah.
like pretty much every Guillermo del Toro project, and he's in the What We Do in the Shadows series. He's just everywhere these days, so he's definitely a big favorite. especially for horror and goth fans, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Really, really cool because I didn't actually know that. But of course, when you go back, when I was reading your notes, I was like, of course, which I think is a great, it's great that is there. And again, props to Doug Jones for being, a great part of the film. Interesting that I didn't know either. Benedict Cumberbatch and Emma Stone were originally cast for the lead roles, but had to leave the project. Now, I actually sometimes I get Tom Hiddleston and Benedict Cumberbatch mixed up. So when I was trying to describe this to people before, I was like, "Oh yeah, it's Benedict Cumberbatch," but no, it isn't. No, it isn't. It's Tom Hiddleston. But yeah, that's an interesting fact. Obviously, Hiddleston's a big name in his own right, and of course, it's a great cast. But these are two, still top, Hollywood performers, Cumberbatch and Stone, that would have been the leads in this project, Mary. That's an interesting fact I hadn't known.
Yeah, yeah, I found that interesting as well. And honestly, I both great actors, and I think they would have done a wonderful job. But I'm really a big fan of the final casting in this film, and I kind of feel like Tom Hiddleston has a little bit more of that Byronic hero vibe to him that they were going for. So I think that the switch ultimately for the final project was a good one.
Yeah. And also, it was nice that I read that a blessing was seeken, suck.
Saw it.
Sought, thank you. Yes, indeed. A blessing was sought from Tom Hiddleston to play the part from Benedict Cumberbatch, and Cumberbatch was happy to be replaced by Hiddleston. I thought that was a nice little fact there, leading to this film. I mean, there's obviously so much we can talk about. I do have a couple more points, and then I have a wider question to sort of finish off with. Um, as you mentioned there, there is a book out there. The end credits imply that Edith has written a novel, based on the experiences of Crimson Peak. Now, this might be a little bit of a dirty sort of question here, Mary, but do you think this would have benefited from any further exposition, a sequel or anything like that, or do you think it works as a standalone, gothic horror romance? I guess if you wanna sort of pile on the genre tags.
I feel like too much more explanation probably would be harmful to the film. It works in a book scenario, you can fit a lot more in, but in a film, if you explain too much, especially where a lot of this film really is building to unraveling that mystery of what's going on with this house and the ghosts and with the Thomas and Lucille Sharp. If you give too much of that information, I think that it takes away from the impact
Hmm. Hmm.
of the reveal, and just having those little hints of things where it's like you kind of almost catch a whiff of what's coming, but you can't be sure, especially with the nature of Thomas and Lucille's relationship, which you can't fully understand until you get to that third act point.
Mm, mm.
And I'm trying not to give too many spoilers, but it's hard in a
No,
film like this not to.
Yeah, of course.
um
Yeah, there's so many things we could talk about, and obviously we want people to go away and watch the film. Once again, the fact that it still boggles my mind that they tore the house down, that they spent so much time building, and everything
yeah.
in the house was made for the house as well. Other little facts there for you guys, sort of checking this out. Just a beautiful film. Mary, I've got a couple of sort of wider questions, wider cultural questions before we finish around the film. Do you have anything else that you want to add about Crimson Peak specifically, before we kind of wind this up?
I mean, it's so hard because there's so many things I could talk about because of all the layers of symbolism, all of the tropes that go into it. I mean, and it's something where I find it interesting because you can read the film as a straight gothic horror story. This is what happens, but there's also on a certain level, the way Edith talks about the story that she wrote at the beginning of the book, the entire journey of the story is also like a metaphor for the creative journey in a lot of ways. So it's like you can read it as this may not be a story that took place, but this is the story that Edith is writing. So it just
Mm.
there's multiple ways to interpret it as well. But like I said, we would need probably a week-long podcast to get through everything I could say.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, I think there's, if people do want a second part, we could certainly consider doing that, but I certainly I'm a big advocate for not spoiling things for people. So if this is your first discovery of Crimson Peak, I hope you enjoy it and I hope you get something from what we've talked about today. But I do think there's a wider sort of conversation, Mary, as we record this in October of 2024, do you think, we've spoken predominantly, about Lucille and Lucille's character, today as part of this sort of the deeper character, obviously played by Jessica Chastain, who, as I mentioned earlier, actively chose not to play Edith and chose to play Lucille. Do you think we have a problem as a society with with kind of pedestaling or certainly becoming too invested in darker characters? The question is prompted as I just went to see Terrifier 3,
Mm.
and Art the Clown has become a cultural icon. And Jason Voorhees was a cultural icon, and I'm not likening those villains, of course, horror movie villains, to Lucille Sharp, of course, played by Jessica Chastain. But certainly, as you mentioned in your notes, there's a nod to Lizzie Borden, and people are fascinated by serial killers. They are fascinated by darker characters. Maybe this podcast wouldn't exist without those characters. But do you think it's a problem on a societal level, that we become enamored with these types of characters? We're obsessed with darkness. We're obsessed with um, evil to a point.
I don't think I think it depends on how you approach it because if you enjoy these characters and watching them and thinking about them and it ends there, that's fine because there's certainly a human tendency to stare into the void. And I think some of that's instinctual because we do have that piece of us, that for survival reasons always has to run through what's the worst case scenario. So I can avoid it. So I think that it scratches that instinctual little itch in our lizard brains, as it were. But I think the problem comes in if you're someone who watches these characters and idolizes them and then thinks, I want to be just like them. And I don't think there's probably a lot of people who would view Lucille as an aspirational character. So I guess from that aspect, I'm not concerned about it. But, there's always, I think you get down to a question of individual responsibility at a certain point there. There may be people who take the wrong message from these things, but overall, I think that obsession with dark things for most people does just come from a place of like, if I see these things and I sort of think about it and I learn from them, maybe I won't fall victim to them,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
it
go
can
on.
be healthy in its own way.
Indeed, indeed. But there's also a wider conversation. I wasn't going to bring this up because I've just thought about it. Again, the gothic romance tropes, the stuff that is here, the sort of toxic tropes that we see in this film, but also, in your other cliches, your Joker and Harley Quinn. Obviously, there's been a Joker film just come out as well,
Mhm.
which is very centered around that. The gothic romance stuff. Is it beautiful or is it dark? Especially in this film, of course, you have Edith sort of become stronger than just the damsel in distress, as we said, work out that this romance is toxic and wants out eventually. But it takes a while. Do you think that again, on a similar line to that previous question, we can all become victim in lives to, in our lives to that kind of idealized romance? The beauty, in this case, it's the lovely British man with the British accent comes to America and sweeps the American girl off the feet. But obviously, there are much more sinister motives for that. Of course, again, without spoiling the film too much, this is a long lineage of Tom Hiddleston's character and the couple, taking advantage of people. So my point, sorry, with my neurodivergent ADHD brain, my point is, do you think we can get swept up alongside those darker characters in an idealized version of romance? And do you think gothic romances and kind of alternative films perhaps like this, perhaps like the Joker, if you want to use that tag. I'm sure people will disagree. Do you think that that can glamorize those types of toxic relationships at all?
I mean, it definitely can, and it depends on how you treat it. Because I would say, like, in a film like Crimson Peak, you get that full story where it's all those red flags. Ultimately, it's like,
Mm.
oh, she probably should have paid attention to those,
Hmm.
and that can be a good thing when it's presented that way. Whereas, like, I'm going to contrast it now with, say, a book and film series like Twilight, who I have a lot of bones to pick with. There are so many red flags in those relationships, and because the author wants it to be this great romance, you goth over the problematic age gaps and power dynamics and a lot of toxic behavior that happens over the course of the books or films. So a lot of the onus there is really on how the creative producing the work treats those red flags. Is
Mm.
there is definitely a danger if you write a book where it's an I can fix him book that teaches all the wrong lessons. That can certainly be harmful. But in, a case of Crimson Peak by the end of the film, I feel like they've resolved the if you ignore these red flags, bad things can happen to you. These people are, and for
Yeah.
all intents and purposes, they may as well be vampires because they just choose a victim and, literally take their life in order to keep surviving. So,
Yeah.
there is that aspect to it where I think it does serve as a warning, that those kinds of relationships can be a massive problem and you should be aware of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's some really good, strong themes here. Again, without going into too much detail or spoiling anything, these are some of the themes that I would hope people pick up on or interpret. And of course, if you've got your own ideas, people watching this, or own themes that we might have missed today, then please do stick them in the comments or get in touch with us on our social media. I'll get Mary to summarize and do the links in a second. Couple more questions, Mary. One's a personal gripe of mine with the end of the film, and I want you to explain it to me. Um, how the heck does Lucille see Thomas at the end? Because she turns, she says you can help him, before she hits him with the spade. She's not dead yet, but how does that happen? How does she see Thomas?
I think that this is obviously Edith is able to see
Hmm.
ghosts throughout the entire film. My assumption with Lucille being able to see Thomas is probably because of the closeness of a relationship, and I think that he very much intends to be seen by her is
Right.
probably it. But to a certain degree, I think that's one of those moments where you have to do that suspension of disbelief thing because otherwise the film ends much more horribly.
Yeah, yeah, it was very much by like it was one of the things I was like, hang on a second. But again, of course, if anybody disagrees or has an issue or even an explanation for that, please do put it in, the comments and things. I guess the overarching message is if a ghost wants to find you or wants you to see them, they're gonna let you see them. You know, this is
Absolutely. Just on the note of the ghosts in this film, like real quick before we wrap
mm,
things up, I do want to say one of the other tropes that I kind of love that they subverted in this is that the ghosts are not trying to harm Edith. It's the living people that are the real
mm,
threat throughout the film, which is just feels like very different for a film involving hauntings. Usually, you
mm.
traditionally expect the supernatural forces to be the ones that are after you.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. You see in the with again, conscious of spoilers. There's a recording note. There's a recorded note that Edith finds, and it sort of adds to that. The ghosts are just trying to help Edith. They happen to have, because of their gruesome deaths, quite a scary visage, as it were. So it makes them look frightening, as they're crawling towards Edith and
Absolutely.
they're moving slowly and doing all these things that horrible villains or horrible monsters would do. But actually, as you say, the more the film goes on, I think we can interpret those ghosts and ghouls to be the good guys here.
Absolutely. And I love that a ghost leads her to a recording. It's the most BioShock feeling thing I've ever seen in a film.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we've certainly exhausted without again we if we go into any further into this, we'll probably be spoiling stuff for people. So go and watch Crimson Peak. For people, because I'm not as familiar as perhaps I should be as someone that's co-hosting a podcast about goth and dark films with Del Toro's work. What is your fascination, Mary? Because I know you're a fan with Del Toro. You mentioned, he's very in depth as a creator. He has very dark visions for his films, and it has become synonymous with this type of filmmaking. So, where do people go if they want to discover more about Del Toro and what really drew you to him in the first place?
I definitely would suggest checking out his films first and foremost, especially for those who are don't mind subtitles. I definitely recommend looking for The Devil's Backbone, which is less well known than his, Hellboy or Pan's Labyrinth, but is another one of his Spanish language films, also featuring our favorite actor Doug Jones because he's in everything. I'm pretty sure he's in that one. I could be wrong. But it's just another great ghost story, but really anything he does, the attention to detail, the aesthetics, there's just so many layers to his work because he tries to incorporate so much things. And I also definitely would recommend if you're interested in him, look him up on social media because he posts a lot of in-depth information about his characters and his creative process when he's working. And there's some just really beautiful pages from his sketchbook. He's also a just phenomenal artist. So it's just worth any way you can find his work, just taking a look at it.
Fantastic. Go ahead and do that, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us for our second episode of Morbid Movies. Mary, what can you tell us? Pressure is on. What can you tell us about when we'll be back and where people can find us if they're interested?
Okay, well, we will definitely be back next month to do another movie. We haven't discussed which one yet, so it'll be a surprise to us too. And if you do want to find us and let us know what you think or suggest a movie or anything like that, you can email us at morbidmoviespod@gmail.com. We're on Instagram at Morbid Movies Podcast, Twitter at Morbid Movies Pod, and we're on Blue Sky at Morbid Movies.
Excellent. Fantastic, Mary. Well, it's been a pleasure to catch up with you. I love doing these podcasts with you as an excuse to talk about cool movies, but also to just chat. So, is there anything more you'd like to add, or are we finished? Are we done like Thomas at the end of Crimson Peak? Dead, finished, you know.
I'd just like to add, if you're a fan of these kind of gothic horror films, definitely watch the movie. And my only forewarning is it does deal with a lot of dark and violent themes. So, for the lighter of heart, maybe just read the Wikipedia summary, but otherwise absolutely dive in. And also, just as a shout out, if you're into the deeper trivia, if you go to the TV Tropes website for this film, it goes through an incredible amount of the symbolism and tropes that they work with that we couldn't get to here today. So definitely just a further reading recommendation.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for watching, guys. Thank you, Mary. And we will see you next time on Morbid Movies. See you again soon.
Bye bye.